Hello students, I'm welcoming you to a chess concept that is very important to know that we call two weaknesses. First of all, what it is? Well, the idea is that if your opponent has one weakness, it's usually not enough to win the game because opponent will just dedicate all of their resources to defend that weakness. Of course, they're going to be passive, but the weakness is still going to be protected enough. And the idea is that then a player should strike to provoke the second weakness, somewhere on the other flank usually, in order to split the opponent's resources into half, and they would not be able to cover both wings or both weaknesses. Well, this is the theory. I would like to show you some practical examples, one endgame of mine, and then a little bit more complicated example played by Botvinnik, who was the world champion, in the middle game with many more pieces. So take a look at this position. I was playing with the black pieces and it's dead equal endgame. I have slightly bit better king and therefore maybe black would have slightly bit more chances, and we also have same color bishop endgame. However, white has the pawn on the dark color square, which I could attack with my own bishop, and I have all pawns on the light squares, which means they're safe from opponent's bishop. But unfortunately, even though I can attack that pawn on b4, they could always place the bishop and defend it, and I have no ways to increase the pressure. I would want to play the move king to c4, but his king is never going to move and will always claim that square as his. So this game, for this reason, should be equal, but white played the move g3. Now here comes a problem that not only have now the pawn on b4 as white that I could target, but you also have one of or two pawns on the king side that I can target in the future, distant future, with my bishop. So now what I want to do is I want to elicit that weakness. I want to highlight that, because if I just play, for instance, bishop to c7, there is just no threat against the pawn on h2. So what I do first is I play h4 with the idea of exchanging one pair of pawns. I don't care if he's left with h2 or the g3 pawn, but then I will be able to create a threat. Means I put the bishop and threaten to actually take it. And it really doesn't matter if white accepts the pawn and takes it, or I will take on g3 myself. In my game, white played bishop to d2. And after capturing, you will see that this bishop might require to defend both pawns at the same time, and it's probably lost because of what we call two weaknesses. So what I do next is I start targeting one pawn, but of course I have the d6 square in mind from where I could attack both pawns at the same time. My opponent is just waiting, not much of a recommendation we can give to white at this point, and I go bishop d6. However, for this particular moment, he seems to be defending both pawns at the same time. And we are very close to a position that we would call Zugzwang in chess, if my pronunciation is right. It's a moment in the game where you don't want to make a move, because every move that you would make would weaken something that your opponent would be able to capitalize on. So what black needs to do currently is just get to exactly the same position with their own move. Because if it was with white to play, because if it was white to play, currently the bishop cannot move, because as it would move, I would be able to take one of the pawns. And if the king moves, they lose the so-called opposition, and my king would be able to invade into their position, as you will soon see. So what I do is I just make a waste move, and I have an idea of going back after they make their own bishop move. So currently the bishop of white is not required to defend the pawn on b4, so they just play bishop f2. Now I go bishop c7, because if I was to go back to d6, we have the same position with my move again. I don't see a win there. So what I do is I play bishop to c7. There are many other moves perhaps that would work as well. And after he goes back, I replace my bishop back on d6, and we reach the same position with white to play. And here the position is lost. Like for instance, if they move bishop to f2, we can take the pawn on b4. If the bishop goes to the other diagonal, I can take on g3. And if the king goes, for instance, to left, I can go to the right and I will win the pawn. and if the king goes to right, I go to left, and the pawn is still gonna drop. So that's how white himself created the second weakness, and I was able to capitalize on that. If white didn't play the pawn move to g3 and he just waited in the position, or perhaps played a move like h3, I could never ever win this, because he just needs to defend one pawn. So the bishop could just stay bishop d2, c3, e1, d2, c3, e1, d2, c3, e1, until it gets too boring and I just offer a draw. So this was an endgame stage, maybe a little bit different from what we and how we would use this in the video game. So for this reason, I have a second example, and this is with the white pieces played by greatness himself, the world champion Mikhail Botvinnik. And one thing that we could notice right away is that black has an isolated pawn, which is very, very weak, and white is pressing against that with everything he has. So it feels like white's setup is ideal to attack that lonely pawn. But currently, at the cost of passivity, of course, pieces are immobile of black's, they're just guarding it 4 times, and you cannot increase the pressure. If you were to play a move like e4, you would just allow black to exchange their weakness. So the question is, I did everything correctly, how do I win this? And once again, we will see how Botvinnik uses the principle of the 2 weaknesses. He needs to provoke the second target, but caveat, not at the cost of allowing opponent to get rid of this weakness. So if you go on fishing to the other side of the board, trying to catch another weakness to play against, but you allow opponent to get rid of the isolated pawn, that's not good. So you have to keep it there on d5, then you get the second target to attack, and then opponent will have to scatter their resources to defend both things at the same time. So what Botvinnik does first is rook to d4. We're blocking the pawn, but he has actually an idea in mind. Black is just waiting, says, maybe let's draw, you can't win my pawn, and he shows his main idea. He's trying to provoke the second weakness, which is going to be the black's king, and he goes g4, opening up the second front. Black played queen to c6, and white opens up the king side, because white, first of all, the center is, you could say, somewhat blocked or closed. There's no way black can launch counterplay in the center, and these conditions are conducive to the kingside attack for white. If you're considering playing on the flag, first and most important thing to take care of is opponent does not have counterplay in the center. And white also, of course, dominates the kingside. We have 3 mobile pieces there versus only 1 of black's. So if black was to take this free pawn on h3, we would open up the king side. First, I imagine Botvinnik would play rook to h4 with a smile on his face, because white's position is looking very great. And after bishop moves back to e6, we would just take, and you could see that a big attack is going to follow against the black's king. We could always later also include ideas like king h2 and rook g1 to involve the second rook into the game as well. So in the game, black just took the pawn on g5, we took with the queen. Once again, if bishop takes h3, would have similar consequences. It's almost like a mating net for the black's king. So black played f6, and after a few maneuvering moves, you will see that white's attack is looking scary. We're not gonna take a look at this till the very end, but just how white got the second weakness to play against. White at all cost will keep the queens unless the endgame after queen exchange is for sure winning. We have king h1, beautiful maneuver to also involve the rook into the attack. Queen e5, rook g1. White is statically or slowly moving the pieces to the king side. There's absolutely no need to rush, because once again black is just paralyzed, having to defend this d5 pawn with a lot of pieces. We had rook f8 in the game. Now queen h6, they cannot take the queen due to the pin along the g file. And after rook b8 and rook h4, I believe there is no need to look at more moves. It's a technical phase, and I think you would all agree that white is having really very strong attack, and no one would want to be black. And black still has the weakness on d5. You could also call b6 actually a weakness, maybe even f5 pawn is a weakness, and the king. And one weakness became like 4 headaches, and black was not able to defend everything, and after 10 moves black simply resigned. If you enjoyed the class, consider hiring me as your personal online chess coach. That's my full-time job for almost a decade now. Thank you for watching. Leave a comment and like on this video if you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next lesson. Thank you. Bye-bye.